Whoop. I somehow goofed there. My apologies. I just lost a bunch of people here. I stopped sharing. Maybe I can get it back. Try again.
I don't usually have that trouble until I start telling jokes.
All right, let's check and see if my screen share is actually working now. I should have a picture of Jonathan Neville up.
Looks good.
Verify. All right. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, extended family all. It is a pleasure to welcome you this evening and to recognize that this continuing forum to explore issues of the Book of Mormon only would happen except for the fact that we have people that tune in. And we're consistently staying at about 50 open pictures on the screen in a given evening, or 40 of them, which means about 60 people. And it's gratifying that there's that much interest retaining. But then again, when you look at the quality of presentations, I think that it becomes quite clear. I do want to highlight that in my explorations at the Joseph Smith III home this last week, I discovered the autograph book of his daughter Carrie, and it has a number of significant signatures in it. And I will, of course, be preparing that as a presentation before too awfully long. But I wanted to just let you know that if you would like to plan a tour of the Joseph Smith III home, it is a home where 4 of the Restoration prophets have lived. And I'm intrigued that Jonathan Neville, who's our presenter tonight, has I'm not quite sure whether it's a web page or just what the note is, but he has a strong theme in his work on no more contention. And to me, one of the most profound comments out of the Frederick Madison Smith prophetic opus is let contention cease. And for God to be instructing us to let contention cease through Fred M, and to have Jonathan Neville, who is our speaker tonight, who has visited more than 90 countries in his exploration of the world, and whose appreciation of the arts and antiquities of mankind provides a unique background for appreciating the Book of Mormon and its focus upon the Promised Land. The fact that he's presented previous times on the forum, presenting on some of his 50 or so books published, most recently on the rational restoration. I really appreciate that one, because the restoration wide, there is that fundamental theme that we need to reason things out in our mind, and to be able to have this forum where people can reason together. We've had 6 different presentations on the land of Nephi, in Peru, in Guatemala, in Georgia, in the Malay Peninsula, in Joseph Smith's Head, and in the Chesapeake Bay area. And to be able to allow people to reason things out, present the best information they can get, and try to pull things together to make sense is part of the fun that this old educator sets us up for. And so I very much appreciate that. I keep finding these overlaps between Jonathan Neville, who in his book about the rational restoration pulled in some of the recent revelations from the community of Christ to highlight that we need to reason together in love. And for us to learn to reason together in love is, I think, a restoration-wide, a worldwide need. Well, the fact that he has claimed that Fred M. Smith theme, I think he's probably picked it up there. He may have gotten it elsewhere, and Fred M. was one of the 4 prophets that lived in the house that I'm responsible for now, means that I do want to extend all of you the invitation to come take a tour, get acquainted with this branch of the Joseph Smith legacy, and appreciate that upon our hearts is written a profound message. And as I look back at the history of what I'm digging into, and by the way, I'll be starting an archaeology project there on May 4th. But what I'm digging into on this site is written in the hearts of the restoration. And for us to be able to share that tonight with Jonathan Neville, who is one of the most erudite, published, and well prepared testifiers of the Book of Mormon that we have, it is a real pleasure to welcome him and to welcome to all of you for the privilege of asking questions and making comments at the conclusion. And so with that, let's shift to the screen for prayer. And I guess that's my responsibility. Let us embrace the truth in prayer. And the picture is the picture of Abigail Barnes, the young lady who is the representation of resurrection this year in my experience, because she spent a month in a coma. And it's a picture of her father on the right, her and her mother and myself and Abigail Brown having come to the Shawnee Drive congregation to simply say thank you for all the congregational prayers. They're, I think, out of the Methodist tradition, good, hardworking farm folks, not particularly religious, but they drove 2 hours in order to come say thank you. Let us pray. Awesome creator of the springtime, whose whispers in the greening grass, whose budding daffodils, whose churring red-winged blackbirds are building nests. We see in the cycle of seasons, in the cycle of our lives, in the arc of history, your plan for humankind in which you sent your son, his life to invest. We feel the tingling presence of your spirit and appreciate that beyond our senses, you provide eternity and invite us to reach farther, to look more perspicaciously, to listen with greater acuity to the gentle breezes, the rolling thunder, the aches and pains of our mother, this beautiful earth, to apprehend better, a little more as you do, the extraordinary network of creation, all of it having worth. And we recognize our culpability, our misplaced ability focused upon ourselves instead of on your mission. For wars, famine, hunger, hate, and fear predominate in our history, the story of dysfunction through our willful commission. Yet we gather here on Zoom this eve to explore your words. We seek to embrace intertextuality, to reach beyond the word singular, which probably should suffice, but to gain the interlocking nature, the magnification of your message for us to understand reality. So we ask your blessing on Brother Neville, our presenter, and our participants, grateful for the generations of faithfulness represented in each family crest, while at the same time acknowledging the questionable preparation that we bring to grapple with eternity in our mortal tests. Bless us, we pray, in the name of Christ Jesus, the Anointed, whose resurrection we celebrate in this season. Amen. Brother Neville, the floor is yours.
I should unmute first, huh? Okay.
Yes, please.
Well,
well, before you finish.
well, to start off with, I hadn't thought about the No More Contention page for about a week because, and I'll bring it up here to show you in a second, but in fact, let me do that now. But since you brought it up, I'll just share that screen. It's a little blog that I have to promote this idea of no more contention. I assume you can see it now, right?
Yes.
Okay,
We
it's
seek
just
clarity and charity.
yeah.
Rational, yeah.
And I want to explain a little bit of the background of this. part of the genesis of this idea was actually from this forum, Paul, because you guys, how long have you been doing this now? 3 years or something?
This is the fourth year.
Fourth year. And every single time I've been able to come on, it's had this spirit of clarity, charity, and understanding. And those are kind of the three principles that I've identified sort of as no more contention, because I see a lot of contention coming from lack of clarity. People don't have disagreements about things because they don't even know what each other is trying to say. The second part is charity, which is we give everybody the benefit of the doubt, and we assume they're acting in good faith. And maybe the most important is understanding, to seek understanding rather than seek to convince or convert or to compel someone else. And so those are kind of what I try to focus on, is clarity, charity, and understanding. And your forum here, Paul, has exemplified all of those three. The other thing I want to point out here is, if we had the Book of Mormon in the order in which Joseph translated it, the very first verse would be Mosiah 1:1. And it says right in there is no more contention, right? And I think that one of the purposes of the Book of Mormon was to produce a world or a society in which there is no more contention. And I love the idea of, and I wish Joseph had put the plates of Nephi at the end, as he translated them at the end. So the very first verse of the Book of Mormon would talk about no more contention. But when you mentioned this, Paul, I pulled up the website. I hadn't looked at it since February. And my latest post on here was Jonathan Edwards on contention, which I totally had forgotten about. And it's an article in here where I talk about some of the things that Edwards said. You can see here some of the examples here. He talked about trying to get rid of a spirit of contention, why a spirit of contention kills religion, and so forth. So he had a lot to say about it. I listed, I don't know, maybe 10 or 11 quotations from him. He actually talked about contention. I think I listed it in here. Let's see. It was several hundred times. Oh yeah, he used the term contention over 300 times and contend over 180 times, usually with the sense of trying to eliminate contention. So if anyone's interested in that, you can just type in no more contention in your URL and it'll bring up that blog. Okay. Well, now with that.
Thank you. That's a neat clarification, because I was not aware of a predecessor to Fred M. Smith, and here Jonathan Edwards is clearly that predecessor.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, totally. And, of course, I think Joseph Smith was influenced by the language of Jonathan Edwards. So when he talked about no more contention, that was something that Edwards was advocating many times in his lifetime, to eliminate contention. Okay, so now I did do a PowerPoint. I'm a little reluctant to have death by PowerPoint. So at any time, you can stop me and I can turn off the PowerPoint. We can just have a conversation. But there's so many images that I think are useful that I wanted to do a PowerPoint. But it's totally optional. We can just have a conversation if anyone prefers. So let me share this screen just to make sure we're all looking at the same thing here. The topic here for tonight was enhancing understanding of the Book of Mormon through intertextuality. I think the emails had a different word there, but I intended intertextuality, and I'll explain that in a second. We'll talk briefly about the King James Version and Jonathan Edwards mostly. And so I want to start with the definition of intertextuality, which is a complex interrelationship between a text and other texts. So it can be, in this case, we'll talk about the Bible and Jonathan Edwards, but it has two aspects. One is it's basic to the creation of the text. Whoops. There might be some timing on this, which I'll have to turn off. And also the interpretation of the text. So there's those two elements, the creation and interpretation. And I'm sure you're all familiar with, many of you may be familiar with Royal Skousen's book on this. He did a book called, I have it here. Probably can't see it if I hold it up in the window, but it's going to fade out with my virtual screen anyway. But he did a book called The King James Quotations in the Book of Mormon. And one of the quotations from the book is that the Book of Mormon is a creative and cultural translation of what was on the plates. He said not a literal translation, and I think most of us would tend to agree with that because for all the reasons we've discussed in the past. In my view, Joseph translated the plates into English using his own mental language bank, his vocabulary and syntax and so on. And we can see the influence of the King James Bible through direct quotations, long and short, specifically the Isaiah passages and Malachi and portions of the Sermon on the Mount. But it's also through a process called blending. And Royal Skousen put this example in his book, and that is of the idea that the Book of Mormon contains chunks of familiar language from the Bible. And this is a passage. Now, I forgot to convert all the references to the Book of Mormon to the Community of Christ version. So hopefully you can appreciate that. But basically, the end of Moroni, last part of Moroni, he had this long passage where he says, and again, I would exhort you to come into Christ, lay hold upon. We all know that. Royal Skousen pointed out some of the passages from the Bible that these verses come from, or at least are familiar language. So when Joseph Smith was translating, presumably he was familiar with these biblical passages, and they were part of his mental language, so he adopted them and put them in here. But you can see that this section of Moroni draws from Hebrews, James, 2 Corinthians, Ephesians, Isaiah, Exodus, Isaiah, and Jeremiah. So that's what we call blending, where you take passages from all these different parts of the Bible and combine them into a beautiful verse or two in the Book of Mormon. So we should expect the Book of Mormon to consist of chunks. We all speak in chunks of language. That's how we think. And so I'm going to give this example that Royal gave us from Mosiah LDS 1821, but I'm sure we all know this. He commanded them there should be no contention one with another, but they should look forward with one eye, having one faith and one baptism, having their hearts knit together in unity and in love towards one another, or towards another. So the phrase knit together can be found two places in the King James Version, in Judges and Colossians. So here's how Colossians phrase it, that their hearts might be comforted, being knit together in love. And you can see that that's not a direct, the Book of Mormon is not a direct quotation from there like the Isaiah passages, but it's a combination, or it's a blending here of Colossians. You can see their hearts knit together. And then the part of unity comes from Psalms. So you can see Psalms had a verse where it talked about dwelling together in unity. So if we put those together, you can find here that Mosiah, this passage from Mosiah, draws from Colossians and Psalms, even though it is not an exact blending, because the other two passages in the Bible have being and dwell and, so they're not exactly the same, but it's chunks of language. So Royal Skousen compared the text of the Book of Mormon with the King James Version, but not with books readily available to Joseph Smith and Palmyra. He and most other scholars I'm aware of that have looked into intertextuality have only looked at the King James Version of the Bible, assuming that's what Joseph Smith was most familiar with. But I've pointed out that there's over 700 non-biblical words and hundreds of non-biblical phrases in the Book of Mormon. So I've talked a little bit about this before. I'm going to show you some new stuff, but just for review, the sources of non-biblical words and phrases are abundant in other materials readily available to Joseph Smith. And some of what we think are examples of biblical blending may be from other sources. And one of these, of course, was the Palmyra newspapers. And we know that Joseph Smith went to the bookstore, the print shop, every week to get the newspaper for his father, because at one point there was a notice that his father had not paid his bill. It was in the newspaper. So we know that he was doing that. And some other people have recollected that Joseph picked up the newspaper every week. Now in this newspaper, this was from September 22nd, 1818, T.C. Strong was a bookseller and printer, and he listed the books that he had for sale. And the one I've outlined here says Edwards Works 8 volumes. And that refers to an 8-volume set by Jonathan Edwards that we're going to be talking about. So if we looked at that 8-volume set, we would find more examples of blending that might make more sense than assuming Joseph took them from the Bible. And here you can see in this list, the Old Testament had this phrase knit together once. It appears twice in the New Testament in Colossians, once in the Book of Mormon, and in Edwards' works 6 times. So, and the phrase in unity only appears once in the Old Testament, once in the Book of Mormon, and 17 times in the works of Edwards. So here's 2 examples from Edwards. He was quoting Colossians 2:2, but he didn't quote it exactly. And then in the second one, he talked about to live in unity and love. So if we combine those here, you can see that the Edwards blending is actually closer than the biblical blending. He didn't have the being and the dwell in there, and he had unity and love as part of his phraseology. So when I look at this, I make the proposal that Joseph Smith could have been blending Jonathan Edwards more than he was blending the Bible. And I have dozens of examples of this. This is just one to give you an idea. So here's another example from the Palmyra Register. If we remember from Alma said they shall be brought and arraigned before the bar of God. And Royal Skousen pointed out that's not a biblical phrase. He assumed it came from early modern English. But right here in the Palmyra newspaper, there was an article about this where the person said, I shall never more see you until God's awful trumpet shall awake the dead, and we are arraigned before the bar of God. So there's another example of a phrase that was likely in Joseph Smith's mind because it was a common phrase used in the newspapers of his time. So I made a list of some of the potential sources of Joseph Smith's language that he had when he was a translator. His mother, of course, Jonathan Edwards, King James Bible, the Palmyra Register, and even the late war, which would be a fun topic maybe someday. But why is non-biblical intertextuality important, and why is Jonathan Edwards important? And I'm going to propose a couple of reasons. Non-biblical intertextuality explains partly how Joseph Smith translated the plates using his own language, also how the Book of Mormon fits directly within Christian tradition and fulfills the hopes and dreams of well-known Christians, authors, and ministers. And that one, I think, has been way undervalued. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And finally, how the Book of Mormon is God's gift to the entire world. It's not only for members of a particular church. You can, and I've talked about this before many times to different groups, you don't have to have any membership or affiliation with any particular church to enjoy the Book of Mormon. In fact, recently, as Paul mentioned, we were overseas. We were in New Caledonia, which is a French province in the South Pacific between Australia and New Zealand. And in the hotel room, it was the Meridian hotel we were staying in, but apparently Marriott purchased that hotel chain because in the room they had a New Testament in 3 languages, but they also had a copy of the Book of Mormon. And there's not many people in New Caledonia who know anything about Mormons, but they had access to the Book of Mormon. They could read it and appreciate it regardless of their religious background. I think that's just a perfect example of what I hope to see, that Muslims, Hindus, anybody really in the world, regardless of their religion, can appreciate the teachings in the Book of Mormon. And this is a slide I made. Through the infinite goodness of God, the Book of Mormon is a possession of all people in the world. And this is just showing our plan that we can all be united as a planet and we can all learn and appreciate from the Book of Mormon. Okay. So the first point here is how the Book of Mormon fits directly within Christian tradition. And I'm just going to review some of the Christian thought leaders over the years: John Wycliffe, Martin Luther, John Wesley. I skipped over one, I think, here, but John Calvin, yeah, John Wesley, and then Jonathan Edwards. And people ask me often that haven't read my book to understand why I say this is, what's the connection between Joseph Smith and Jonathan Edwards? And the connection is, if you notice here, Jonathan Edwards died in 1758. So he was born a little over 100 years before Joseph Smith, and he died 50 years before Joseph Smith came around. So what was the connection between them? I wrote this book called Infinite Goodness that we've talked about before, that explains the connection to them. This is the cover of the book. But the reason I chose the phrase infinite goodness is it's one of the links between Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon and Jonathan Edwards. Now, this may be a little hard to see depending on how big your screen is, but this is some software called Word Cruncher. And I want to encourage all of you, if you haven't already, to download it, because it can do so many things for your scriptural research, and you can add your own text to it that it'll search also. And I'm going to show you how to do that in just a minute. But the first thing I want to point out here is I searched the scriptures, which includes the Bible, the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, for the phrase infinite goodness. And the results here show that it only appears 4 times in all the scriptures. In other words, it's a non-biblical phrase that's in the Book of Mormon 4 times. So what was the origin of that phrase? And then this is shows you how the software looks when it comes up with the results. It shows you the infinite goodness in context. And then it shows you, well, let me go back to that one. This is where it shows, I pulled up the actual verse, but this one shows you how it looks in the different 4 results. So going back to this one, you can see here that it's, you can read it in context in each of the references. And if it had appeared in the Bible, I could have pulled them all up in the Bible, but it didn't. So that's one way I found my non-biblical Book of Mormon phrases, is by doing this search in Word Cruncher. Here's the link to the program. It's called wordcruncher.com. And all you do is install the app. You can install it on your PC or your Apple, your iPad, whatever. I have it on my iPad as well as my PC. But I can't encourage you enough to use this if you're doing any kind of scriptural analysis, because as I pointed out, it does these rapid searches of terms, and it shows you the results here. But you can, I didn't show it on here, but you can add all kinds of other databases that you want. If you have your own text you want to consider. It also has some text contemporary with Joseph Smith, like the Late War, or the First Book of Napoleon, some of those other ones that people say Joseph plagiarized, which in my view, he didn't plagiarize at all. That's another conversation. But you can search those in here. And lots of historical texts, different versions of the Bible, all that. And plus it's free. That's the good thing about it. And they're constantly updating it. So that's a little plug for Word Cruncher, but that's what I use all the time when I try to, when I search for non-biblical Book of Mormon phrases. Okay, so here's the phrase infinite goodness in the works of Jonathan Edwards, 55 times. And I found that interesting as an example of intertextuality. And I'm going to show you how I do those searches too. So you'll have that tool if you're interested in pursuing this more. But when I do the search, this is how it comes up. It shows 1 through 55 occurrences. And this page shows the first 5, and it shows you in context where Edwards used this phrase. Okay. And here's one example. I know not that God ever helped me to preach in a more close and distinguishing manner for the trial of men's state. Through the infinite goodness of God, I felt what I spake, and God enabled me to treat, and so on. So that's how he used that phrase, but there's 55 instances of it. So I want to show you how I come up with those. Yale University has the Jonathan Edwards Center. And you can see, here's the link. It's edwards.yale.edu. If you type that in, and I'll make this PowerPoint available to anybody who wants it, so you have the links, but you can type in a phrase here right in the collection, and it'll pull up those. In this case, when I typed in infinite goodness, it pulled up all 55 instances, which is this result right here that I showed you. Now, it turns out that as I was doing my research, there's a defect in the database at Yale. Of all things. This is the 8-volume set of President Edwards that I mentioned that was published in 1808, that was on sale in Palmyra in the 1820s, 1818 through 1820s. And so as I was going through this whole process, in fact, let me stop my slide share for just a minute, because I want to show you this. I might have to stop the virtual background too. Okay, so you can see I'm in my art studio now, but as I was doing my research on Edwards, I've acquired sort of a distrust of databases over the years, not just as a lawyer, but in my research for books. Seems like there's always gaps and manipulations and so on. And sure enough, just to do a sanity check, I went onto eBay and I purchased an actual 1808 set, all 8 volumes of Edwards' works. This is one of them. So this book is 1808, 100 and some years old. No, 200 and some years old, I guess, right? If it's 1808, 200 and what would that be? 206 years old. So this is what it looks like. And it's happens to be volume 3 of Edwards' works. And what I did when I was going through this process was when I would do a search on the Yale database, I would always do a check if it was in these 8 volumes. But that's obviously tedious to read 8 volumes like this, you can see. Plus, I didn't want to wear them out, 204-year-old books, 206-year-old books. So I found them available on the Kindle. And I found an 1808 edition on the Kindle, and I'm going to share my screen again to show you what that looks like. Let's see, where is it? Okay. So this is what it looks like. Unfortunately, today I looked to see if it was still available and I couldn't find it. Now they're selling them as individual volumes. When I bought it, it was the whole set, and now they're individual volumes. Maybe you can find all 8 volumes. They're only 99 cents each, but still it's annoying to have to search 8 separate volumes, where on my Kindle I can search all 8 volumes in one search. But this, if you're interested in this, this is the 1808 edition, available on Kindle. And once again, even on the Kindle, even though it's all digitized, I found a few errors when they digitized it off the Kindle. So I keep having to go back to my 1808 original books. But still, this is an enormous help. And what I found in the process of doing this is that the Yale database is missing some of the important sermons that Edwards gave that are found in this 1808 edition. One of the sermons that's missing happens to be the one called Natural Men Are God's Enemies, which I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. But that was one of the striking connections I found between the Book of Mormon and the works of Jonathan Edwards, was this sermon that Jonathan Edwards gave. We're all familiar with King Benjamin talking about natural man as an enemy to God, right? It's one of the most common quoted verses from the Book of Mormon. And it's not a biblical thing. The Bible in one place talks about natural man, another place talks about enemy of God, or enemy to God, but only in King Benjamin does it say the natural man is an enemy of God. And Edwards gave an entire sermon on that whole premise, and he used that phrase over and over in this sermon. And I think one of the reasons nobody noticed that before is the Yale database doesn't have that sermon in it. But so you had to get the 1808 actual volume to discover this. I've since, Richard Bushman put me in contact with the people at Yale, and I alerted them to the problem with their database, and they assured me they're fixing it. So, but they haven't fixed it yet. I don't know when it's going to get fixed. I told them about it 2 years ago. So there's still some research to be done in these areas, but this is, for me, it's cool to have this available on Kindle. The other thing that I did just a few months ago, I think I told Paul about this, is I have this, what I call the non-biblical intertextuality database. And it's been a file that I've just been accumulating over the years. It's about 1,400 or 1,500 pages that has, I'll show it to you in a minute in the Word version of it. But I went ahead and put that on Kindle available also, so people can search it and have it on their phones. I keep it with me on my phone now. And as I read the Book of Mormon, or even the Doctrine and Covenants, if I come across a phrase that strikes me as not a biblical phrase, I can pull it up in my database, and usually I can find it in there. And I see how Jonathan Edwards used that phrase in different ways, and it just expands the Book of Mormon a lot. One other reference here is the Jonathan Edwards Studies, and this is, it's just called edwardsstudies.com. It has a lot of references to him. It doesn't have a database, but it has a lot of background to Jonathan Edwards. And this is one that actually I corresponded with Richard Bushman about, because he had some questions and he referred to this history of the work of redemption. This is a little bit of a tangent, but it's really interesting that Edwards wrote often about the work of redemption and the work of salvation, which neither one are biblical terms. And neither one of those appear in the Book of Mormon, but in the Book of Mormon, we have plan of redemption and plan of salvation, used the same way that Edwards used the phrase work of redemption and work of salvation. And so this is one example of others that I found where the Book of Mormon uses Edwards' type of terminology, but it has a change. So instead of saying work of redemption, it says plan of redemption. And I've written a little bit about that before too. One last reference before we get into the comparisons is I have a little blog called Your Daily Jonathan Edwards. And I started it off by actually putting daily, a phrase from Jonathan Edwards. Now it's more episodic, but I try to put things that Edwards wrote that are relevant to those of us who are familiar with and love the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. And the gospel in general, of course. Here Edwards talked about heaven being a place where we would swim in an ocean of love, which is a phrase I just love. And it goes along with the gospel in general. But if you're interested in that, there's lots. I realize Edwards was very prolific, had a lot to say, and it can be very difficult to read through all of his work. So I've tried to summarize some of the key, most profound teachings here on this blog. Okay, now let's look at some examples of things Edwards said. This is an interesting quote. He said, "It seems to me an unreasonable thing to suppose that there should be a God that has so much concern for us, and yet that he should never speak, that there should be no word from him." And this is quite interesting. We could do a whole evening just on that concept about how does God speak to us. And of course, we think that one of the ways he did speak to us is through modern prophets in our day, but also through the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. So Edwards was kind of anticipating that God would speak again to us. And in that sense, was anticipating the restoration. I have a section here on how did Joseph Smith encounter Jonathan Edwards, and I'm going to go through it pretty fast because our time is running short, but I did want to mention one important point. And that is from Joseph Smith's 1832 history, which is partly holographic, part of it he wrote himself. He wrote this: "At about the age of 12 years, my mind became seriously impressed with regard to the all-important concerns of and for the welfare of my immortal soul, which led me to searching the scriptures, believing as I was taught that they contain the word of God, thus applying myself to them, and my intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations led me to marvel exceedingly." Now, traditionally, it's always been thought that his intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations referred to ministers in Palmyra. But when I read this, first off, he never had an explained, or nobody said he had an intimate acquaintance. And most we know he talked to the one minister after he had the first vision experience and was rebuffed. But he never talked about having an intimate acquaintance, meaning hanging out with them and those of different denominations. So after I read this and thought about it and saw the connections between Jonathan Edwards and the Book of Mormon, I came to the conclusion for myself anyway, that when his intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations was through reading their sermons and listening to sermons perhaps, but reading their books. And one of them, as I mentioned, was this 8-volume set of that was published in Palmyra that was available to Joseph Smith every time he went to the bookstore. So that's one. And now why did Joseph Smith encounter Jonathan Edwards? We know that he had it accessible to him right where he was every week, but why would he have encountered it? And this is an interesting topic that I think we've probably discussed this before. When did the restoration actually begin? And usually when I do a presentation on this and I ask the audience, they all say it started with the first vision. And I said, that's not what Joseph Smith said. And here was a time, this was in 1834, I believe, when Erastus Holmes came and visited Joseph Smith and asked an inquiry about the establishment of the church. and to be instructed more perfectly. Joseph said, I commenced and gave him a brief relation of my experience while in my juvenile years, say from 6 years old up to the time I received the first visitation of angels when I was about 14. So he related his experience when he was 6 years old to the time he was 14. That's the period of 8 years. What happened when he was 6 years old? Well, that's when he had the surgery. I'm not going to go through this in much detail because we're all familiar with this, but he had the leg surgery that was life-threatening. And he was sent off to, with his uncle Jesse, to Salem, Massachusetts by the coast. And of course, Jesse was a strict Christian. And this is Lucy saying they sent him so that he could recover, hoping that the sea breezes would help him recover, which I can attest to here living on the coast. The sea breezes keep us quite healthy. But anyway, one thing I noticed when researching this is there was a publication called 4 Sermons to Young Men that was published in or printed in Salem, and it was circulated in that area starting in the 1700s. And I went through this little sermon. Here's the pamphlet it was in, and I found all kinds of non-biblical LDS terminology. The terminology here in red is only in LDS scriptures, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants. Green is in the King James Version as well as in the Latter-day Scriptures. So state of probation, better world, design, eternal happiness, preach faith and repentance. You can see a lot of this terminology that's non-biblical in the Book of Mormon was from this sermon. And here's lots more examples. Okay, we won't take the time to go through those, but that led me to think, okay, Joseph Smith, between the age of 6 and 14, as he said, he had this intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations, and this is part of it. We know that for 3 years, Joseph Smith was laid up, recovering from that surgery. Even by the time they went to Palmyra, he was still lame. Of course, this is the trip to Palmyra. They went along that way. He was unable to work on the farm for much of that years. He had to be carried around, so he had plenty of time to read. And he talks about reading the Bible. That's where I think this intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations kicked in. I'm going to skip over some of this because that just shows that he missed a lot of school. Okay, so, I should mention this too. In the Palmyra Register, another book that was on sale was Hervey's Works. And Joseph had a real affinity for Hervey's works. A lot of Hervey's terminology also appears in the Latter-day Scriptures. And in the Nauvoo Library in January of 1844, I'm sure Paul knows about this, Joseph donated some books, and one of them he donated was Hervey's Meditations, which was also on sale in the Palmyra. So probably wasn't the one he had in Palmyra, but because they lost their books in the interim. But apparently he picked up Hervey's Meditations again, and there's lots of interesting connections there. Okay, so talking about the translation and language of the Book of Mormon, I mentioned early on, maybe it was before we started recording, that I always liked the 1840 edition of the Book of Mormon, because right on the cover, it says, carefully revised by the translator. And so I keep hearing people that say Joseph Smith didn't really translate anything, he just read words that appeared on a stone and a hat. Well, I say he considered himself a translator, and he carefully revised it as a translator. So that's why I like the 1840 edition. Anyway, I'm going to skip over this translation stuff because I think we've been through it before. Okay. So another point here is that comparisons with other materials readily available to Joseph Smith are evidence that he translated the plates, not that he plagiarized anything. And there's a big difference between plagiarizing and using word chunks that are in your mind. In fact, none of us here tonight can say a single word that we haven't heard before. And that's why it's a common language, right? And we have chunks of words in our mind, phrases that we use over and over. And that's why I think when Joseph said he had an intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations, that intimate acquaintance gave him those chunks of words and passages from Jonathan Edwards and others that were just part of his speech that he put in when he translated the Book of Mormon. So again, here's a little bit about Jonathan Edwards' background. This is a stone where commemorating one of the places where he gave his famous sermon. This was one of the churches that he preached in Enfield. This is where he also was was preaching. That particular building is gone. This is the birthplace of Jonathan Edwards in Connecticut. You can see that. He graduated from Yale at age 17. He was fluent in not only English, but Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. By the time he graduated, he was at age 17, which is pretty impressive. The reason they call him President Edwards is he was a president of Princeton University, but he died, maybe ironically, in light of COVID, of a smallpox vaccine that was defective. But he was also the youngest person to give a commencement address at Harvard. So he was, some commentators say that he had the highest IQ of any native-born American so far through the present. And they do that based on his education and accomplishments. So, but again, here's these 8 works from Edwards. How did Edwards help prepare Joseph Smith? And this is where I'll try to finish here in the next 15 minutes or so. But these are some passages from Jonathan Edwards that I believe that the Lord used to help educate Joseph Smith and prepare him to become the translator that he became, okay? This is after discussing Daniel's prophecy, which of course Joseph spoke about. Edwards wrote, "And thus it is meet that the last kingdom which shall take place on earth should be the kingdom of God's own Son and heir, whose right it is to rule and reign. Now whatever revolutions and confusions there may be in the world for a long time, the cause of truth, the righteous cause, should finally prevail, and God's holy people should at last inherit the earth and reign on earth." So these are phrases that are found in the Latter-day Scriptures, but here's another example. The future promised advancement of the kingdom of Christ is an unspeakably happy and glorious. It is represented as a time of vast increase of knowledge and understanding, especially in divine things. A time wherein religion and true Christianity shall in every respect be uppermost in the world, wherein God shall cause his church to arise and shake herself from the dust and put on her beautiful garments and sit down on a throne. Of course, that evokes the language from Moroni: "Awake and arise from the dust, put on thy beautiful garments, enlarge thy borders, the eternal Father." Those are other Edwards phrases. Edwards went on to say, "A time when all heresies and false doctrines shall be exploded, and the church of God shall not be rent with a variety of jarring opinions." This is Edwards' anticipation of eliminating all the different denominations in a spirit of unity. All superstitious ways of worship shall be abolished, and all agreeing in worshiping God in his own appointed way and agreeable to the purity of his institutions. Again, think of young Joseph Smith reading this and hoping for this. It is exceeding manifest that this chapter, Isaiah 60, is a prophecy of the prosperity of the church in its most glorious state on earth in the latter days. And I can't think that anything else can be here intended but America, by, quote, "the isles of this that are afar off." This prophecy therefore seems plainly to point out America as the first fruits of that glorious day. So here Edwards is talking about the prosperity of the church in a glorious state in the latter days, and it would start in America. He says, "Let us remember him, lay aside our sins." Now, this is from the Book of Mormon, talking about the isles of the sea. Jacob wrote that we are upon an isle of the sea. And Edwards just wrote that America was the isle of the sea that Isaiah prophesied about. But great are the promises of the Lord unto them who are upon the isles of the sea, right? Okay. Edwards goes back to say, this new world is probably now discovered, that the new and most glorious state of God's church on earth might commence there, that God might in it begin a new world in a spiritual respect when he creates the new heavens and new earth. Such being the state of things in the future, promised glorious day of the church's prosperity, surely 'tis worth praying for. So in the 1700s, he was anticipating the glorious day of the church's prosperity and said it was worth praying for. Well, all the things here that are in red are non-biblical Book of Mormon terms. Nephi said, "Prepare your souls for that glorious day when justice shall be administered unto the righteous." And then in Helaman, we read, "This same year there was exceeding great prosperity in the church." And so great was the prosperity of the church and many blessings that even the high priests and teachers were themselves astonished beyond measure. So as I read this, I see Jonathan Edwards anticipating and praying for this, and the Book of Mormon showing the fulfillment of what Jonathan Edwards prayed for. And even Joseph in one of his letters wrote about this. He said, when I contemplate the rapidity with which the great and glorious day of the coming of the Son of Man advances, I cry out in my heart, what manner of person ought I to be in all conversation and godliness? Again, using that same terminology. Here's one, a phrase called wickedness and abominations. And I did the search using Word Cruncher. And you can see that phrase appears 35 times in the Book of Mormon, twice in the Doctrine and Covenants. And because it doesn't show any biblical reference, it's another non-biblical phrase. It doesn't appear in the Bible. But here you can see that. One thing this shows you also that of all the, compared with the Bible, if there's a green line and a red line, the red line is actual and the green is expected. And what this means is if all the scriptures had the same frequency of terminology, then the Book of Mormon should have that many, but instead it has the red number. In other words, the green would be expected and the red is the actual. That just shows a highly disproportionate occurrence of the phrase in the Bible because it's not in the Book of Mormon because it's not in the Bible. So here's some examples from the Book of Mormon. To make a full account of all the wickedness, abominations, and so on. Continual scene of wickedness and abominations. Here's a passage from Edwards. He wrote about, has been a scene of wickedness and abomination. And then other times he talked about wickedness and abomination that I won't take the time to go through here. But that's just to give you another example of a Book of Mormon phrase. Wickedness and abominations is non-biblical, but a continual scene of wickedness and abomination is even more significant because it's more words. And Edwards talked about a scene of wickedness and abomination. So that, to me, that's another intertextuality that shows the relationship between Edwards and the Book of Mormon. And as I've said already, the Book of Mormon contains hundreds of non-biblical terms, phrases, and concepts that are found in the works of Jonathan Edwards, and the same is true in the Doctrine and Covenants and in Joseph's personal writings. So to me, that's evidence that Joseph translated the plates. But it's also, as I pointed out before, it's evidence that the Book of Mormon fits directly within Christian tradition. And this is why I'm hoping that more and more Christians will appreciate and understand that the Book of Mormon is in their own tradition. And it's what their own ministers, the founders of some of their churches, anticipated, particularly Jonathan Edwards. Okay, I'll go through a couple more examples. It looks like we have 6 minutes. So I'll do these as quickly as I can, but here's through the infinite goodness of God. Edwards wrote in Mosiah, we read about through the infinite goodness of God, same exact phrase. Another one, the infinite goodness made profitable to a number of us in Edwards. The Lord saw in his great infinite goodness in Helaman, another infinite goodness one. Infinite mercy is another one. It only appears once in the Book of Mormon. It's nowhere in the Bible, but here Jonathan Edwards talked about it in a very similar way. This same passage from Mosiah also has the phrase vilest of sinners, which is a non-biblical word that Edwards wrote about, also in a similar way as it appears here in the Book of Mormon. And let me just use this as an example. So in the Book of Mormon, we read, and thus did the Spirit of the Lord work upon them, for they were the very vilest of sinners. But the Spirit of the Lord worked on them anyway, right? Because of the infinite mercy of God. Edwards wrote, the righteousness of men is of so little worthiness that it is not sufficient to recommend any more than themselves, but the righteousness of Christ is sufficient. 'Tis so excellent worthy in God's account that 'tis sufficient to procure favor for the vilest of sinners. So in both those examples, the term vilest of sinners is used to show how God's grace can work even for the vilest of sinners. It's beautiful. It's awesome. Okay, the natural man, I have a whole section on natural man we'll cover later. Here's another example of being spiritually born of God. This is from Alma, where he said, I ask of you, my brethren of the church, have ye spiritually been born of God? That's not a biblical term, but Jonathan Edwards talked about being spiritually born of God, and he added a little angle to it that's very interesting. we probably don't have, I'll read part of it. He said the prophecies do moreover represent that those that are the people of God or his Israel in the times of the Messiah will not be so by natural birth or external descent from Israel, but by some spiritual birth, whereby persons of the nation of Israel or other nations are immediately created of God and spiritually born of God and descended of Israel. That's a very interesting explanation of what it means to be spiritually born of God. It's like being where Joseph talked about being adopted into the house of Israel. That's how Edwards used that phrase. So when we read that in Alma, we can see it has a lot more meaning than maybe just only looking at it in Alma when we compare how Edwards used it. The next thing Alma asked here is, have you received his image in your countenances? Edwards talked about his image upon him. Again, I don't have time to read the whole thing, but he talked about the countenances. He says, yet at the same time they shall see infinite love in his countenance to them. Their countenance shall also be changed, but not as the countenances of the wicked will be. So when Alma talked about, have you received his image in your countenances, Edwards gives us additional context for that. What does that mean? And then the last one here, have you experienced this mighty change in your heart? When Edwards talked about the natural man, he said, natural men without a mighty work of God to change their hearts will never get over their enmity. And that's essentially what Alma was asking too. Have you experienced this mighty change in your hearts? Mighty change is another non-biblical phrase that Edwards used several times. I didn't put the mighty change in this example because I thought it's interesting to see how he said the mighty work of God would change their hearts. And that's how Alma used it. Okay, so those are several examples. And it's just about 7 o'clock. So I timed this to be right on time, but I had some other really awesome stuff to show you if we have time later that are from this database that I mentioned. I just wanted to also mention that not only the Book of Mormon have I gone through and annotated this way, but also Doctrine and Covenants, Joseph's personal writings, like that 1832 history. And it's in all of them. I can show you some of those if you want later after during the Q&A, but the analogy I give here is the Book of Mormon refers to the law of Moses, but never explains the law of Moses, right? So if you never had the Bible and all you had was a Book of Moses or Book of Mormon, you would not know what the law of Moses really is. Let's take a person in China who has the Book of Mormon but not the Bible. They would not know what law of Moses is. So we need the intertextuality of the Bible to understand what the Book of Mormon means when it talks about the law of Moses. And it's the same with natural man as an enemy to God. If we read Jonathan Edwards' sermon, it makes a lot more sense when we know exactly what Benjamin was talking about, because he didn't define the term. He just said natural man is an enemy to God. What's a natural man? Well, if you go to Jonathan Edwards, he explains it. And there's dozens more examples that we have that I could go through, but I think my presentation time is up, Paul. So
I'm anxious to get a comment in, and then let's open it for questions and answers, and then when there's a pause there, you're welcome to jump back in.
Okay.
Let me first of all remind people, call attention to the fact that we earlier had a presentation by Faye Shaw, which was a representation of the words of Claire Weldon, if I recall correctly, who indicated that there were over 500 references to the Christ in the Book of Mormon, the large majority of which predated his birth. And so if you're really interested in the story of the Christ, here is one of those intertextual phenomena that needs to be appreciated by Christians, because there's so much more evidence about the Christ in that book.
You know, Paul, let me, since you brought that up, this is what Richard Bushman and I were talking about, because he pointed out that there's a lot of, say, pre-Christian Christianity in the Book of Mormon, right? And that's, the critics have pointed that out. Edwards, his final work he was working on was a history of the work of redemption, he called it. And he had done several chapters of it, but he hadn't finished it when he died. But his whole point was to show that God, was to show Christianity existing from the fall of Adam all the way through the end of the world. And so he was aiming at showing what the Book of Mormon does actually show, that people knew about Christ before he was born. It's a very interesting observation that would deserve a whole nother presentation, but it's along the lines of what some of the, there's been a lot of discussion about the Deuteronomists, that the Bible was changed to remove a lot of the plain and precious parts. And it's along those lines that Jonathan Edwards was working as well. So
Blair Bryant gave us a presentation on that theme not
Yeah.
long ago, and so it's just fascinating how great minds are working together here.
yeah, it's cool.
I do want to go back to your 1840 edition of the Book of Mormon.
Okay.
Having had the privilege of excavating there and finding a bunch of those pieces of type, to
Mhm.
me, there is another theme that needs to be highlighted. For Ebenezer Robinson, in May of 1840, walked after being 10 months sick with malaria. He walked from his log house a block west to the Times of the Seasons and felt, he said, as though a ball of fire had hit him in the head and settled in his bones.
Mm.
And that fire in his bones he carried into the Times of the Seasons and told Don Carlos about it. And Joseph came and he told Joseph about it. And that fire was a motivation that they should republish the Book of Mormon, because the 1830 edition was gone, the 1837 edition of Kirtland was gone. They had been driven out of Missouri. All of the Book of Mormon copies were out, and they were printers, and he wanted to get that. He had this fire in his bones. He asked Joseph to raise $200. He and Don Carlos proceeded to raise $200. Joseph failed, but he did take a copy of the book and revised it.
Mhm.
And it was that copy that Jonathan Edwards put in his pocket in June then to go to Cincinnati and get it stereotyped and get it published, so that they had 2,000 copies by the end of that summer. And they had the authorization for 2,000 more copies after that. And you can't tell by looking at the inside which of those copies you were copying from, but I understand that if you look at the spine of the book, you might be able to tell that difference. In any case, the fire in his bones is something that's clearly evident in your bones as you continue writing and perusing these issues and helping to bring the clarity back to our attention of the fact that this remarkable, marvelous work and wonder is still coming forth.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny. I love that phrase, "fire in your bones," because it does get into you. Having spent time with you in Nauvoo, I know you've got a lot of fire in your bones too. But I really appreciate that background, because that's a good history of that 1840 edition that a lot of people don't know about.
It's such a fascinating story for him to. They only raised $140,
Yeah.
and he made the trip to Cincinnati with that book in his pocket with $140. He sent $40 or almost $40 worth of paper back to Don Carlos to advertise that they were going to be selling the Book of Mormon at $1 a copy.
Hmm.
And he didn't even have an agreement for it yet.
Yeah.
So he started going through Cincinnati looking for somebody that would help it. He got turned down, and then went to Shepard and Gleason, and Mr. Shepard said, "I want to do that book," and helped him get no money down. He got the paper for it. With no money down, he got the binder in leather.
Mhm.
$550 worth of copy work he got with $100 down, and the promise to edit and work on it himself at 25 cents an hour. Fire in his bones
Awesome.
paid off.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, let's give people a chance with those hands up. It's there's a lot of people with fire in their bones here.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Monty, and then we'll go with Val. Go ahead, Monty. Did I freeze up? Monty,
You're muted.
you're muted. Where'd he go?
Well, he's still muted.
So,
There we are.
yeah, my phone didn't want to cooperate. Uh, I was going to, one of the things I was going to ask us, and the subject thing was, is everybody having trouble with the signal coming from Kansas City dropping out?
No.
I don't know, because I've had trouble hearing Paul, and because the signal keeps dropping in and out.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Anyway, what I was gonna say was when I first joined the church, you know, I'd been doing for me was a lot of scripture study, and during that period of time, the Lord had I felt had really, you know, given me several truths about the scriptures and about the way things were that I firmly held to, and I was just indignant to an unreasonable extreme when people would disagree with me. Why couldn't they see this truth like I did? And I think that a lot of us have to overcome that aspect of our allowing ourselves to be ministered to, because I'm able to appreciate other points of view now far better than I used to be able to, and I'm thankful for it. I cut myself off from a lot of important knowledge and study that way, and so that's why I feel like this class is such a gold mine. We've got people who have dedicated a goodly part of their lives to studying the things that I should be doing every day. But the material that they bring to the class is just priceless. And whether you accept it or you're skeptical of it, just knowing it's there is important too, because you get to see the world from a whole lot of different perspectives. My wife and I got into one of the biggest arguments we ever had over Psalm 22, because I believe that Jesus was quoting scripture, and she believed that he was living the scripture at the time. And there's a difference, in the way you approach it, but because of the translators, who knows? And but I just could not see it that way. I had this in my mind a certain way, and by golly, nobody's going to tell me otherwise. And I think a lot of us let ourselves get into that mindset, and it makes it impossible for us to open ourselves up to other people's point of view. Anyway, I've taken up enough time. I'll let you go.
Well, let me comment on that. That's a really good insight, Monty, because Jonathan Edwards himself was fired as a minister because his congregation disagreed with him on a doctrinal issue, and neither he nor his congregation would budge. And so they said, "All right, you're fired." And then after they fired him, they realized there was no other minister available, so they let him stay on for a few months. But that's what led him to go on a mission to the Indians, the Stockbridge Indians in Western Massachusetts. And if he hadn't gone there, he wouldn't have written all the books that he wrote, because he was there in a challenging circumstance for many reasons. It was challenging, and he was trying to figure out, how do I explain the gospel to Indians that have no Christian background? And so he had to kind of go back to the basics and sort it all out. And he wrote his most influential books while he was on that mission to the Indians there in Stockbridge. But it was all because he got fired because he was so obstinate. So, but again, as we started this meeting off, as Paul mentioned, the No More Contention website, that's exactly what I'm hoping to get at, is this idea of multiple working hypotheses. We can, if we seek understanding instead of trying to convince someone, then we'll all be better off, and we'll eliminate contention. You know, I did an interview recently on a podcast, and we discussed how this idea of being adamant and my way or the highway is really based in insecurity, because it's a sense that we have to have other people agree with us, or maybe we can't trust our own beliefs. And when we're confident, then we can share, understand one another, we can seek understanding and not feel defensive or attacked either way. So I really appreciate what you said there.
Okay, Val, you're next, and then Ron.
All right. So I really like the work you've done, Jonathan. I think it's really important, especially for our understanding of translation. Now, so what I wonder, and it wouldn't matter necessarily whether this influence of Jonathan Edwards on Joseph's vocabulary was direct or indirect, but I think it might be. So the question is, you've shown that the Jonathan Edwards 8-volume set was in the bookshop in Palmyra. Do you have any indication of how much it cost, and what would that be in present day dollars? Because my understanding is Joseph Smith's family was pretty poor. Now, I don't know if they let you come into the bookshop and sit there for an hour reading a book every time you came for a newspaper or not. I think they might be a little leery about that, because your hands could mark up the book and everything, and that
Sure.
might reduce its value. So the question of whether Joseph could afford those books would be relevant to whether he was directly influenced by Jonathan Edwards, or, because Jonathan Edwards was so influential at the time, indirectly influenced because all the preachers maybe were reading Jonathan Edwards' work, and his vocabulary suffused the entire culture. So do you have anything on the price and whether Joseph?
Yeah, I do. Actually, it's the price is on that. Well, no, wait, maybe they didn't put the price on there. But this is one of the reasons that having the actual volume is so important, because you know these are 8 volumes, and it would have taken a long time to read all of them, right? But when I looked up that, I don't have the volume right here. This is volume 3. It's in a different volume. But I was looking up the Natural Man as an Enemy to God article, the sermon that's in here, and the one that preceded it is titled Joseph's Temptation in Egypt. And when I saw that, I could just see how Joseph would be flipping through here, looking at, you know, the different headings. Here you can see some of them. And one that would attract his attention, I think, would be Joseph's Temptation in Egypt, because that was his name. So I looked at that one, and sure enough, on the first page or two of that sermon, there's lots of non-biblical Book of Mormon language. And so I envisioned Joseph reading, perusing, whatever you want to say, that sermon. And the very next one, when you get to the end of that sermon, the next page is natural men are God's enemies, or natural man is the enemy to God, whatever it said. And so that led me to conclude that of all the articles in here, all the sermons, the one about Joseph would naturally be interesting to Joseph Smith. And the very next one is the natural man is God's enemies, which is the one that, in my view, influenced the whole King Benjamin thing. And so it's more than just, I mean, that's obviously circumstantial evidence, but it's putting yourself in Joseph's place. What would a boy between the ages of 6 and 14 be interested in? Joseph's temptation in Egypt, I think, would be a pretty logical thing. And to have that sermon be the one right after it that he would have encountered is significant.
Well,
as far as the price.
Oh, the price. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. The price, he didn't list the prices in here. And that book was on sale for several years in the newspaper. Most of the books that they had on sale were listed for several years in the newspaper. And so they were sitting on the shelf. Whether he replaced them when they sold, we don't know. Whether they borrowed them or not, we don't know. We know his mother said she had a famous thing in her thing where she said Joseph wasn't as interested in the perusal of books as the other kids. So when people say that they didn't have enough money to buy books, the other kids had books, you know, so that's one thing. It seems to me that, you know, I don't know if Joseph would have borrowed a book when he visited the bookstore, but I wouldn't have put that past him either as a boy. But the one thing we do know is and I can't remember which, there were the two people that were his contemporaries in school that wrote about him, and I can't remember which one is which. And I haven't looked at that for a while. But he was working in the print shop, and he said Joseph was a lingerer. What was the word he used? He had an adjective to describe what kind of a lingerer is. If Jim Lucas is here, he might remember what it was. But he was known as a lingerer in the print shop, to the point where on one occasion they took the daubing ink that they used to put on the press, and they daubed Joseph Smith's face with it just to get him out of the store.
Hmm.
So, and he remembered that incident. So it wasn't like it was just a casual visit. He was described as lingering in the store.
Well,
And
if he
so,
borrowed in quotation marks the way you indicated at one of the books, I think after reading it, he would have not borrowed anymore because.
exactly. That's for sure. Yeah, for sure. Or he
But
could have rationalized it away and at least returned it, so.
well, I think again, it wouldn't matter too much if the influence is indirect, because I think it's likely that Jonathan Edwards' vocabulary suffused his community. But still, that's a really important question as to whether any
Yeah.
kind of direct influence could be shown.
Well, and that's what, it's amazing that we even have the account of him lingering in this print shop,
Yeah. Right.
and because that's a type of detail you would never expect to see in history.
All right, let me turn you over.
Okay, well, let me mention one other thing about it, though, and that is I didn't pull it up here. I could if you want, but I have this list of it's 1,400 pages of the words and phrases that are common, the non-biblical words and phrases that are common to the Book of Mormon, that I think would be difficult to pick up just in hearing it in a sermon. And especially when I tied them to the sermon that would have an interest to Joseph Smith as being named Joseph. And there's more detail I could get into on that, but hopefully that at least addressed your question. Okay.
Okay. Ron Smith and then Phil. Go ahead, Ron.
Excuse me, Ron, I'm going to crowd in here just for a moment to suggest that possibly Uncle Silas provided access to that kind of book as well.
Yeah, Uncle Jesse too. There's well, and that brings up another point. There was when I went to the Museum of the Bible in New York, I was or in Washington, D.C., they have a display on Jonathan Edwards. And one of the things they show is these little loose leaf pamphlets that floated around with his sermons in them. And those are distributed widely. They're very rare now. It's hard to get a copy of them. I haven't been able to find one even on eBay anywhere, but they did have one on display there at the Museum of the Bible. And because those floated around so frequently, that's another source that he could have learned from these sermons. In addition to that, there's Christian newspapers and journals that floated around that were people subscribed to and passed around at church and so on, that Joseph would have had access to, that were very often had Jonathan Edwards sermons in there too. So it wasn't necessarily this volume, and I'm certainly not saying he read all 8 volumes. And in particular, I think the sermon on Joseph's temptation in Egypt and the National Man as an Enemy to God, those stick out as being next to each other in one of these books. But I think you're right, Val. There could have been lots of other sources for him, or for him to have an intimate acquaintance. I think implies that he was reading them and studying them. So, anyway, okay, Ron.
Yeah, I want to thank you. I found the hypothesis that the word chunks that were used in the translation came from other places. That's a really fascinating hypothesis, and appreciate all the work that. Well, I don't know all the work you've done, but I mean, appreciate the work that went into that. I finally got around to reading Eusebius, and my son has MS, and I go over and read to him every morning. So we go through some stuff, but and I was fascinated. I was because I had never realized that Eusebius starts off by talking about the antiquity of the gospel, at least as far back, knowing about Jesus and his name and everything as far back as Moses, but alludes to it beginning with Adam. And I was just wondering if that was something that might have been available to Joseph, or if you've looked into Eusebius in that way.
You know, I could pull it. It'd take me a minute to pull it up. If I remember right, Eusebius was on sale there. It was amazing, the books that were on sale in Palmyra. They had, of course, all of Shakespeare, but they had what we would consider very difficult reading in our day.
Yeah.
Eusebius, they had the well, I'm tempted to bring it up, but it'd take a long time to do. But I could send a link to Paul, because I have the. Well, let me just back up how I got into this. So we were in Mauritius. My wife and I lived in Mauritius for a while to help with the university, and I didn't have much work to do. Mostly my wife was meeting with government officials and stuff. And so I had this question: where did the language come from? And since I had time on my hands, I started looking up the Nauvoo newspapers. And I ended up downloading PDFs of all the Nauvoo newspapers between about 1823 and 1828, something like that. And I just started reading through them, searching through them, and finding all these things. But one of the things that really stuck out to me was this T.C. Strong bookstore and the number of books that were on sale there. I haven't even read most of those books, you know. And it's a fascinating list to realize that Joseph Smith had access as a young boy to that type of resource.
Mhm.
And I'd be happy to, Paul, I'll send you the list. You could email it out if you'd like, because I took images of it, so it's easy to see. And it may spur some more inquiry. What I did when I didn't stumble upon Edwards until long after I started all this, because I was thinking of the more obvious resources that were available to Joseph Smith, like the newspaper. And when I would search for these non-biblical phrases, it kept coming up with Jonathan Edwards, but I never saw Jonathan Edwards on the list of books for sale. It just said Edwards 8 volumes, and I didn't know what that was. But I certainly didn't think it was Jonathan Edwards until later I realized that that's what it was. And they just referred to it as Edwards 8 volumes. And so it was a process of elimination. I've gone through a lot of the books on that list and done word searches and so on, and found none of the Book of Mormon language in most of them. It was mainly James Hervey and Jonathan Edwards. But I have a list of all the ones that I went through, and that's one of the things that led me to this Jonathan Edwards as being so influential. Another question that I've gotten, I'll anticipate, is, well, Jonathan Edwards was so prolific, would his writings include everybody's word everywhere? Sort of. And so I did a sanity check on that. I matched Jonathan Edwards to Oliver Cowdery and Sidney Rigdon, and there's virtually no matches at all. But between Joseph Smith's personal writings, Doctrine and Covenants, Book of Mormon, it's replete with them. So that's just another tidbit we didn't have time to get into. But okay, who's next, Phil?
Hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what was coming to me as you were progressing through all this was that we know good and well no man cometh to the Father except the Father draw him. And so the Spirit is the Holy Spirit, which was given for us to lead us and guide us into all truth. And I really think that's really powerful when we stop and think about the burning of your bosom, which is mentioned in the book and in the Doctrine and Covenants and all those things. Well, the fire, and I heard you guys talking about the ball of fire, you know, and well, really, as we're sitting right here, we should be able to feel our way through this by following the Holy Spirit. And I think that's a real powerful statement to say. But the thing is it is what led Joseph Smith. And in all of that, all these endeavors that you see going on, the Spirit was there, moving left, right, go here, go this, pick up this, do that. And so that's one reason made him a very peculiar person, you know, to the world. Everybody said, well, he wasn't like everybody else. Well, yeah, I guess so, because he was understanding to follow the Spirit. And you're no different. We're supposed to follow the Spirit in all the things that you put forth right here. We could follow the burning of the Spirit in your heart, and it shall lead you and guide you. And I think that's fantastic, because I don't see destruction ahead of us. I see power and glory coming. And so I think the closer we get into the joy of the Lord and get filled with the very things that Joseph Smith and all that and God had planted for this to happen, the stronger we are to give to and minister to the world. And so I say, and I'm Nora McWintu, Indian. And the thing is my people, they have also talk about the man upstairs, if you want to say, or God. They say, oh, Elibus, creator God, the one who created it all. And so when it comes down to it, so was the Osage Nation right there in Independence. They had Jesus. And I keep saying this every time because they saw Jesus. And he said, I am Jesus. He said, lay your weapons down, fight no more. And they did so. And to this day, and I say, like again, I talked to the chief at that time in 2000. And he told me the story personally. And so I think that's really powerful. My people are from California on the West Coast, and we traded together. That's a long ways to trade, isn't it? My goodness. Are there runners, and our runners would run back and forth bringing different things. But the thing is Christ is the ingredients that we need for healing now, and to open the revelations of our minds and our souls, not just revelations that are being read to us, but to feel it burn, the witness of it. And that's what makes us of Christ. Thank you.
I appreciate that. You know, and I mentioned how Joseph Smith said it all started when he was 6 years old, right?
Yeah.
And what happened to him? We talked about the leg surgery, but he really had a near-death experience at that point.
Yeah.
That turned him into becoming a religious seeker. And I had a near-death experience myself. I might have related that here, but it does change your outlook on things. It gives you a different perspective. And I think for Joseph Smith, he became a religious seeker at that young age. That's why between the age of 6 and 14, he acquired an intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations, because he was seeking and he was following the Spirit, just like you said.
Mm-hmm.
And he was seeking it in the writings of these other Christians. He had a fire in his bones to know the truth. And it's awesome. And each one of us can have the same thing, of course, if we pursue it. But I think Jonathan Edwards certainly did. And when you learn about his life and the way he described things, he had a very strong fire in the bones. And I'm hoping to make his work more available to everyone who knows about and loves the Book of Mormon, just because of how integral it is. And it expands on the Book of Mormon, as we've talked about. But I really like what you said, Phil, about having that burning feeling and desire.
Hey.
Jim's next, huh?
Yep.
Yes, okay. So it's Seamus Turner, and he
Seamus
described
Turner, that's
Joseph
right.
as the meddling, inquisitive lounger. Meddling,
He
inquisitive.
said inquisitive too?
Yes.
I forgot that.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, no, meddling, inquisitive lounger who would hang around the print shop and the bookstore.
Okay.
Jonathan, may I suggest excuse me, I have a cough, so I'm not going to do it. I'm going to ask you to do it. You need to tell the story that Richard told us about the connection between the Joseph Smith papers and the Jonathan Edwards papers.
Okay. I don't know if I've told that story here before, but probably everybody's forgot if I had. So, well, when I met with Richard and we had lunch together, and he was very interested in this Jonathan Edwards connection, because his first two published papers were about Jonathan Edwards, it turned out. And he said that when they started the Joseph Smith Papers Project, they had brought on some of the people from Yale at the Jonathan Edwards Center, because the Jonathan Edwards collection at Yale is kind of a world-class, even though it has problems with the database, it's a world-class reference resource. And they wanted their input on the Joseph Smith Papers, how to organize it, how to present it, and so on, how to catalog it. And he said at the time they had considered doing a joint project with Joseph Smith and Jonathan Edwards, but they didn't know of any connection. They couldn't find a connection between them that would justify doing a joint project. And so he told me I should have been there 15 years earlier. Because if I had produced this book and the other research, then they could have done a combined effort, and it would have been fantastic. It would have been so exciting, but I was too late. So I wasn't even doing church research 15 years ago. So
Okay, Val,
but
go
it's,
ahead.
yeah, go ahead, Val.
Okay, so you mentioned, and I think it's a important point, that if the law of Moses, if we didn't have the Bible and we saw the phrase the law of Moses, we would want to have some kind of context of where it came from. And you've clearly identified that a lot of the Book of Mormon vocabulary is rooted in Jonathan Edwards. So my question is, and you've studied Jonathan Edwards quite a bit at this point. Reputedly, he was a Calvinist, and the Book of Mormon is Arminian in its theology. Jacob Arminius believed that it's actually a really interesting point that that people have the ability to choose for themselves, and the Calvinists tend to think that all of our choices are dictated by God, that we are predestined for one outcome or another. That's actually
Right.
a pretty important theological shift. And as I say, the Book of Mormon is pretty clearly on one side. Was Jonathan Edwards a firmly committed Calvinist in your reading of him? And if so, wouldn't this mean that even though they might be using the same language a lot of times, it would have different meanings?
That's a great point. And I can tell you that I found a place where Jonathan Edwards said, I am not a Calvinist.
Huh.
Because he was accused of being a Calvinist. But of course, he was a Puritan. And so he definitely had a Calvinist background. And as I read him, he kind of, I don't want to say he shifted or changed his mind over time, but I think he had sort of a multiple working hypotheses approach. And he didn't want to be pigeonholed into one thing or another. He did talk about the Armenians and the differences that he had with them. He talked about why the Catholics were wrong. He engaged in some of those sectarian debates, but he was much more, I hate to say open-minded than the typical Calvinist was.
Did you have a
And
feel for what he thought about human will and whether our will and choice actually could be determinative of our salvation, or if it was kind of dictated outside by God's will?
yeah, I haven't done an in-depth analysis of that, because I went into this assuming that Joseph didn't borrow his theology from Jonathan Edwards anyway. And I think that you can find examples of Edwards talking about free will. In fact, I think I'd have to do a little research on what the name of the thing, but he did a whole sermon on free will. So I don't know if I have it in front of me here. But I know what you're talking about, the debate between the two, and he was involved with that debate. But when I saw the statement that he said, I am not a Calvinist, I thought, okay, that should resolve the issue right there. But I know there's theologians that say he was a Calvinist in some respects. So,
All right. Thank
but
you.
seriously, he was very fluid. He had a lot of different ideas about how God works, but I find it very compatible with our doctrine, at least the parts that Joseph Smith incorporated.
Okay. Monty, go ahead, please.
I suppose I draw on this example quite a bit in when I'm talking about honesty. If you're in a courtroom and you've got 5 different eyewitnesses to the same thing happening, and you have them all segregated from each other where they can't swap impressions. You're gonna, and they're all honest people. And they firmly believe they're telling the truth as they know it. You're going to wind up with 5 different versions of the truth.
Yeah.
And it's up to the jury to decide, sort through all of this stuff, find out the commonalities in the stories, and decide what most likely the fact is that's buried in there, underneath all these truths that they're hearing. And God tends to use us when he talks to us. He tends to use us where we're at. I mean, spirituality is with most of us, at least, is a kind of an evolutionary thing. The Lord brings us on along a little bit at a time. And when we finally get that down right, then we move on to the next part of it, and the next part, and the next part. And the problem is we don't want to screw up the fundamentals, or we're going off in, West 40 before we know it. But I really believe that when the Book of Mormon says, any inaccuracies here are the inaccuracies of men, not of the story itself.
Mhm.
And they realize that we have a tendency of looking at something, listening to someone's account of it, and then adopting that account, because we're all so desperate to find the truth, and we may not be
Yeah.
all that interested in the facts. And so anyway, I'm done. I just wanted to.
Well, you're
that.
totally, I appreciate that. In fact, just today, before I came on here, I was helping someone with a legal issue, and their version of the facts was completely opposite of what the other person's was. And they were trying to explain their point of view and how they were right, in this court filing. And I just had to say, well, I understand from your perspective what you're saying is absolutely right, but the judge is going to decide, and you can't expect the judge to just take your point of view because the other person has the opposite point of view. And it's the same with all these historical accounts, even when someone writes something in a journal, it doesn't mean that what they're writing is true. It's their perception of what's true and their version of what happened. And that's why, when we have these little tiny indicia of what happened in history, like this incident of Joseph Smith being called a inquisitive lingerer in the print store, that tells me that at least the people that worked there thought he was annoying and he was lingering all the time, right? And other people will tell me, well, that doesn't mean he was reading books. And I said, well, everybody I know that hangs out and lingers in a bookstore reads books, right? So why else would you linger there? But people can interpret it different ways too. But you're right. I mean, we all we have our own life experiences to draw on, our own circle of influences that we draw on, and the best we do is try to unite with the spirit of clarity, charity, and understanding, where we're not trying to convince everybody that we're right, but we want to understand how they approach it. And then we don't have contention. Getting back to the theme of the evening, maybe, Paul. Okay.
Okay, David Kaysen, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. I wanted to say I really do appreciate the information that you passed on. It's actually made me want to read a little bit more about Jonathan Edwards, and also getting in touch with that word cruncher. I think that would be a great tool to use.
I
And,
hope everybody here does that. It's really an awesome tool.
yeah, but I have a different perspective than what I've heard voiced here a little bit, and I hope that you'll bear with me when I try to explain it. I get the connotation that you're saying, using the term Joseph's language and everything, and that he was copying or taking words that he'd heard from somebody else, and Jonathan Edwards is an example and everything. But and it may be or may not be true. I don't know. I don't believe it's true, but I don't have any way of knowing for sure. But what I do know, or what I'm convinced of by reading the scriptures, is that Joseph Smith was moved and guided and directed by the Holy Ghost. And one of the things that you're given by the power of the Holy Ghost is wisdom and knowledge. And I think a lot of men before and since Joseph's time have been blessed the same way, by their intelligence, by their wisdom. You could even say by their holiness. And I think that that's where Jonathan Edwards comes in. He was able to grasp from his understanding, his wisdom, the purpose or the principles of the scriptures to understand that would open up the power of the Holy Ghost to him. So the language that he spoke and the language that Joseph spoke, not all the words, but I'm just talking about certain words like you pointed out, were not words that originated with either one of them, but they originated with our Heavenly Father. And he expressed this through the gift of the power of the Holy Ghost. So they all speak the same language in one way or another. We just have to be able to discern where that information comes from through that language. But that's just what I believe. I don't, because I think what Joseph did, I think he translated, and he may have picked up words, but I think those words were not that he picked up from, I mean, he may have heard them and everything, but they were familiar with him when he was doing the translation in writing the Book of Mormon. Anyway, that's what I believe, but I really do appreciate the information that you've given tonight. It's a good, I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you.
Well, I think that you brought up a really good point, and a lot of people have observed through the years how Jonathan Edwards was inspired by God to do what he did. You know, he was instrumental in the First Awakening. You know, with who was it, George Whitefield and the others, where he was really calling for a revival of religion in New England to counteract the influence of the age of reason, so to speak, where they were trying to say religion was out of date and should be done away with. In fact, Thomas Paine's book Age of Reason was really popular, and that was one of the things that Edwards was confronting, was this rationalism coming over from Europe. And so he really was the most influential American behind the First Awakening. And he was also influential in the Second Great Awakening, even though he was dead, because people were quoting him, citing him so much. So he was, at least in my view, as you expressed, he was definitely moved upon by the Holy Ghost and inspired by God to do what he did. And I agree with you also that the Spirit would have inspired them both to use the same terminology to express the gospel. In fact, I think the first section of the Doctrine and Covenants says God gave these commandments after the manner of his language, right? So God can only speak to us in our language. I like to point out that Joseph Smith didn't translate the Book of Mormon into French. He translated it into English because that was what his language was. God could have theoretically had him translated into French, but that would be contrary to how God works with us, right? In fact, even the scriptures say the Holy Ghost brings all things to our remembrance. And that's how, in my view, the Lord worked with Joseph Smith. He had incorporated this biblical language, the language of those of different denominations, including Jonathan Edwards, through his yearning and searching for God. He incorporated all that language, and then God could pull upon that language after the manner of his language when he translated the Book of Mormon. That's why the Book of Mormon fits so perfectly within the Christian tradition too. So I appreciate what you said there about the importance of the Holy Ghost in this whole process. Good. Well, there's no more questions. You know what? Do you want me to share my screen real quick? I'll show you the list of all the words and phrases.
Sure, please.
Okay, because this is pretty, to me, this is impressive. And I have to tell you, when I was working on this when we were living in Africa, and for about 2 years, I was accumulating this database, and I told a few people, and people kept telling me, you need to publish this, you need to publish it. And I didn't want to because I figured I'd face a ton of criticism. Plus, it was a lot of work, and I just wanted to keep it all to myself. But I was prevailed on to publish it and to put it online, so I've done it. So I'll show you here what it looks like. Okay, so can you see it now?
Yes.
This is the Word document. So the left column, maybe I can enlarge that. I probably need to enlarge it, right? Let's see. I'll zoom it to 200%. Oh, it didn't. I thought it would increase the column, but it didn't. Well, can you see here in the left column where it says table of contents?
Yes.
Okay, so this is just a list of all the words and phrases that are non-biblical words and phrases that are in the Book of Mormon, in some cases in the Doctrine and Covenants or Joseph's writing. I'm just going to scroll down. If you want me to click on any of them, I can.
Now, where is this list from?
This is in my database. This is a Word document right now, but it's in that, I put it on the Kindle, so it's easy to access for people. It's called what's it called, Jim? The Non-Biblical Intertextual Database. I can give you the link here. But you can see all these words and phrases.
Go to the bonds of love, please.
Arms of love. Okay, where was that?
Bonds of love.
Arms of his love. Okay. So now I need to shrink this back down so we can see it. Okay. Arms of his love. You can see it's not in the Old Testament or the New Testament. It's once in the Book of Mormon, but Edwards used it 12 times. So in the Book of Mormon, again, this is using the LDS chapter and verse, but it says, but behold, the Lord hath redeemed my soul from hell. I have beheld his glory. I am circled about eternally in the arms of his love. Here Edwards talked about being embraced in the arms of his love, the state of God's dear children in the everlasting arms of his love. I only put a few examples. I didn't put all 12 of them in here. That just gives you a feel for the connection between the two.
That's neat.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. I just love it. And I love it because these beautiful phrases, the arms of his love, we only get one example in the Book of Mormon, but Edwards gave us another dozen. And each one of them kind of helps fill in the significance of that phrase. You can see if I go down here, there's lots of them. We're still just in the B's. Now the C's, things like change of heart, chains of hell, these things that you think are in the Bible, but they're not. I was surprised. Demands of justice, demands of the law. Some of them are phrases like destroying angel, destroyed forever that we associate with Jonathan Edwards, but they're in the Book of Mormon. So dwell in his presence, dwell with God, endless happiness. That's another fun one. It's 4 times in the Book of Mormon. Edwards only talked about it once in that particular phrase, but it's interesting. It's in one of Watts's hymns. And I have a whole section in the book where I talk about the correspondence between Watts and Edwards. And Edwards was instrumental in introducing hymns into church meetings in New England also. All these eternal words, everlasting phrases, exceedingly, fallen state, filled my soul, even flint. Fountain, lots of fountain. I didn't put all the fountain in here, but he talked about fountains very often in beautiful ways.
It's fun just to look through this all day.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? And I added some more just today, actually, because it's come now to the point where whenever I'm reading the Book of Mormon, looking up a phrase, I say, wait a minute, that's a unique phrase, and sure enough, it is, and I find it, and it's just fascinating to see all these. And I have another database of intertextual things. So like the one I showed where our hearts knit together in love. I have a whole bunch of those that are Book of Mormon phrases that aren't direct from the Bible, but they're combined of different verses. And I show that many of them come from Jonathan Edwards. In fact, there's some passages in the Book of Mormon that are, you could say they're misquotations from the Bible because they're close, but they're not exact. And I've shown that they're exactly how Jonathan Edwards paraphrased the Bible. And it shows up in the Book of Mormon. Those are really interesting. I'm just going through these, you can see them all. So
Anything about reasoning together?
reasoning together, let's see, I don't remember that. Reason to rejoice, reason to suppose, those two. I don't know about reasoning. See, the Book of Mormon says, well, let's see, I have reason to rejoice, right? Therefore, have you not great reason to rejoice? In this case, I didn't even bother to put Edwards because he had 25 of them, but I did put one from Baker, which is another topic. But see, I should add the Edwards ones in here. Reason to suppose. I did put a few of Edwards in here. The Book of Mormon, I have reason to suppose, we have reason to suppose. Edwards says we have reason to suppose.
Oh,
So, yeah, there's 24 of those. But again, I didn't put all of them in here. I just put a few sample. Here's some more. We have reason to suppose. We have reason to suppose. So it's just a common thing that Edwards used that shows up non-biblical again. Rebelling against God, redeem all mankind.
Go to that redeem all mankind. That's directly out of
It's in Alma.
fifth chapter of Helaman.
Well, the specific phrase, according to the word cruncher, only shows up in Alma, redeem all mankind. There's probably a variation of that in Helaman. And it's in Moses also, but Edwards used the same phrase, redeem all mankind. Now, this is an interesting one here. This reference is from the life of David Brainerd. David Brainerd was a Christian missionary to the Indians, and he died. He came to live with Jonathan Edwards because he was in poor health, and he died after a few months. And he asked Edwards to publish his autobiography. So Edwards did. He called it The Life of David Brainerd. And a lot of it is Edwards' explanations and then Brainerd's journal entries. But it became a missionary handbook in the 1800s, well, late 1700s and 1800s. Christian missionaries everywhere took the life of David Brainerd with them because it was so inspirational. And a lot of these connections that I found are to David Brainerd's book. I also bought an original copy of that one too, just so I could double check it. But
Okay, if I could, the Helaman 571 in my Book of Mormon says, "The resurrection of Christ redeemeth mankind."
Okay, redeemeth. Yeah, so that would show up a little differently.
That does show up differently? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Although, Edwards used DH. I probably didn't search for that specific phrase. He had redeem all mankind, but I'll put that in my word cruncher. And yeah, it shows up in Helaman. You're right. But I won't take the time to look it up in Edwards, but now that you know how, you could look it up there.
Yeah, thank you. That's just beautiful and delightful.
Yeah.
So much
here's all these.
off of this kind of presentation. Thank you so much.
I did want to show you one last thing that you'll be amazed at. Okay. I know it's late, but this is worth it because it's pretty striking.
It's not even 10 o'clock yet.
Yeah, 5 minutes. Okay. So one of the things that I like to do is annotate the scriptures and Joseph Smith's writings and anything else I can. And so I did this little annotation of Joseph Smith's 1832 history. As I mentioned, it's partly in Frederick G. Williams' handwriting and partly in Joseph Smith's. So if it's in blue, it means it's in the King James Version and Jonathan Edwards. If it's in red, it's in Latter-day Scriptures and Jonathan Edwards only, not in the Bible. If it's in green, it's only in the Latter-day Scriptures, and if it's purple, it's only in Jonathan Edwards. Okay, so this is Joseph Smith's material. I'm not going to go through all these, but you can see here's blue and green, which means King James Version or LDS Scriptures only. But if you scroll down here, Joseph's handwriting begins here. All these phrases in purple are not found in the Bible or the Latter-day Scriptures, only in the writings of Jonathan Edwards. And look at how many of them are in here.
Wow. Wow.
And
Wow.
look at this one. Isn't that
Wow.
amazing? So this to me is, if the other stuff isn't evidence of Edwards' influence, this really shows me that he had an intimate acquaintance with Jonathan Edwards. And this is in his own handwriting. So isn't that
What about,
interesting?
were the misspellings the same?
Well, I doubt it, because Edwards' work when it was published was edited.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I haven't gone back to look at Edwards' handwritten stuff. He could have had different spelling in there. And I found, by the way, speaking of spelling, if you look at the Yale database, some of the spelling is different than it is in the 1808 edition, which
Yeah.
complicates things as well. But that's just because spelling wasn't standardized.
Yeah.
Curious.
I don't.
Your
I
focus
don't.
right there is on living faith, and living as the EING.
Yeah, exactly.
Does-
So
does-
I don't see Joseph Smith sitting there with a copy of Jonathan Edwards' books, copying phrases. I see him as having read them and just put them as part of his mind. A lot of people point out that he had basically a photographic memory anyway. I have a whole paper on that a friend of mine wrote, a professor, that hasn't been published yet, but I could see how these phrases would just become part of his intellect, part of his mind. And you can see here, I mean, I have all the notes down in the bottom in the footnotes where I show that these are non-biblical phrases, not in the Scriptures, but in Jonathan Edwards' works.
Does Word Cruncher, does Word Cruncher have the ability to pick up spelling variants, or does it have to be identical for it to pick it up?
I believe you can do spelling variants in there. I always do it identical because of the type of thing I'm looking for, but it's pretty flexible. In fact, let me pull that up again. I could pull up Word Cruncher right here. Share that screen. I'll just show you quickly how it works. I know we're going into overtime here, but since I encourage you to do it, let me share it just briefly here, just so you get a feel for how flexible it is. Okay, so this is the what I just searched for Paul, where he said redeemeth all mankind, and it pulled up. Sure enough, in Helaman, it's the only place where it shows up. If I was to search for mankind, then it would pull up all the instances in all the Scriptures here, Old Testament, New Testament, etc. And if you want, you can expand the window here and see, okay, it was in Leviticus. It'll tell you what chapter and what verse. Or you can click on it up here, this one from Leviticus, and it shows it in the context. So now I did it by putting the words in quotation marks, which means it has to be an exact match. If I just put mankind, actually for that word, it probably would be about the same, but if I just do mankind, it might have a few different results. I don't know. But it gives all kinds. You can ignore the case, you can ignore the type, I mean, there's more capability in here than I ever use. But it's pretty cool. I used this actually for when I came up with my non-biblical database, because how do you know which words are in the Book of Mormon that are not in the Bible? I use Word Cruncher to sort that out.
It's neat.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And then I'll show you here. So here's some of the other references I have loaded. Early LDS periodicals. It has Times and Seasons, the Messenger and Advocate, all those in there. It has U.S. Constitution, American Revolution, first book of. I put these in here because first book of American Chronicles, first book of Napoleon, and the Late War are what some of the critics say Joseph Smith plagiarized. So I assume Joseph Smith read the Late War. I mean, it'd be strange if he hadn't, because it involved the War of 1812 right by where he lived. And it was written for school children. But that doesn't mean he plagiarized from it. It means he would have been familiar with the language in it.
are the Joseph Smith papers, the extensive Joseph Smith papers, are they available in ways that you could put into Word Cruncher?
Not yet. Not that I know of anyway. I wish they were in Word Cruncher here, but they're not that I know of. Here's Josephus is in here. You can search all of Josephus. In fact, when you go to the library, I'll just open the library real quick. Word Cruncher bookstore. So these are some of the things that are available if you want. It has the 1830 Book of Mormon in here. A lot of this is LDS oriented, but not all of it. Original text of the Book of Mormon, U.S. Constitution, apocryphal writings. Let me find some others down here that are stylish Bible collection, which has, well, there's parallelisms in the Book of Mormon if you want to go through the Hebrew parallelisms. Original text of the Book of Mormon, that's Royal Scouts and stuff. The New Testament, okay. Here's some, this looks like a Latin book. Corpus of Syriac literature, Dead Sea Scrolls are in here.
Is there
Early
anything that
English.
is there anything that gives you origination of words?
Like a etymology? They might have one in here. I don't know. I haven't. This Evans early imprint, I use that a lot also because it's a collection of all the early American writings going back to the 1600s. And so I use that for comparison too. American Chronicles, these are American history, I guess.
Is that Ted Corpus, the TED speeches?
I don't think it has all of them, but I've never opened this one, even though I installed it. It has a lot of them, I guess. I could open it and see. Well, I could open it from up here and see. Josephus, here's dictionaries. If you want those. Word Cruncher lexicons to find all forms of a word. Then it has some literature, Les Miserables, Shakespeare, John Milton, Pilgrim's Progress. I've looked at Pilgrim's Progress as a potential source too. There's not much there. U.S. Constitution, religion, creeds of Christianity, early Christian fathers. You know, there's a lot of stuff. Hebrew law in biblical times. There's Farrar's Life of Christ, Edersheim's Life and Times of Jesus and Messiah. The Quran is in here, Septuagint. You can see, I mean, there's more in here than I would ever access, even though I've downloaded a lot of them. And then you can see just more stuff about Book of Mormon topics and so on. So most of those are free. Some of them, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have to pay for. But I have a lot of them already downloaded. And let's see. All my library items are all these. Here's Hervey. So I mentioned Hervey and Dean. I added those myself so I could search them. There's just tons of material. I mean, you know, you could go through this forever. But you saw how quick it was. I mean,
That's great.
When you go through scriptures, think of another term, just say resurrection. So it shows you the incidents of resurrection in the Old Testament, the New Testament, none in the Old Testament. New Testament, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, a great price. So that's how quick it is.
Wow.
All right, that's enough of a sales pitch for free software. But I do hope everybody gets it because it saves so much time and it gives you the fire in the bones to study the scriptures. So there you go.
Oh.
Okay, well, I guess our time's up. Paul, it's been delightful as always. Wish I could be here every week.
Well, thank you. It's been delightful. I agree, and I very much appreciate that you've still got a bunch of people anxious to tag along and follow and work through these areas where contention could be. But if we can work beyond that and let the contention cease, then our prospects of participating in the more Zionic community are dramatically increased, I believe.
Yeah, exactly.
When Rena nudged me on the day before Christmas, she encouraged me to tell the family to enroll in the spiritual university.
Beautiful.
For us to be enrolled in the spiritual university, tonight we're seeing some of the resources in that library. And I thank you so much, Brother Neville, for sharing this with us. I would hope that all of us can take the courses that we really need to be taking in order to be prepared for the dimension that is the next one that we're to enter. Good night, the Lord is watching o'er you. Good night, his blessings go before you. Good night, and we'll be praying for you. So good night, may God bless you.
Good night, everybody.